morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here today. I'm stooping, so my very tall voice will get caught on this mic. Can you hear me in the back using this mic? Okay. All right. Well, I am delighted to introduce Luise von Flotow today. Luise von Flotow has taught translation studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada since 1996. Her main research interests have focused on feminist and gender issues in translation, translation as cultural diplomacy, and audiovisual translation. Her publications include a long and fascinating list, the Routledge Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender, Translating Women, Different Voices and New Horizons, Translation Effects, the Making of Contemporary Canadian Culture and Translation, Translating Women, Translating Canada, Charting the Institutions and Influences of Cultural Transfer, Canadian Writing in Germany, Translation and Gender, Translation in the Era of Feminism. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Luise von Flotow to our conversation about Tibetan translation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really interesting time so far, and promises to continue to be interesting, and I hope that my input will be of interest as well. I'm going to talk about feminist translation and a kind of history of feminist translation, and then its move into what is called the transnational realms right now. And I'm using a text that I wrote recently for PMLA, Publications of the Modern Languages Association, which is putting out a special issue on translation sometime this fall. I'm not sure exactly when, and asked for it. It strikes me that translation is becoming more and more important in U.S. academia and in U.S. modern languages studies, and which is very cool. I did my PhD at University of Michigan finished in the early 90s, and was told not to write a dissertation on translation or in the field of translation because that's academic suicide. So perhaps now, 30 years later, things are changing, or is it 40 years later? I don't know. 30 years later, things are changing. So I'm going to use the text that I wrote for PMLA, which is relatively dense because we only had 2,500 words, and then enlarge on it here and there. And I'm happy to take questions or have interruptions if you wish, okay? And then finally, I'm going to refer to this book, which is one of the ones that Sarah mentioned, Translating Women. There's one article in here that I edited and that joined the book, which is comes from Sri Lanka, and has to do with the use of ancient Buddhist texts in order to introduce contemporary feminist ideas to Sri Lanka via translation into Sinhala. So I thought that is one that may ring a bell here, even though it is Southeast Asia and not Tibet, but maybe it'll be of interest. Okay, so feminist translation developed really in the late 1980s, very strong over the course of the 1990s, as feminism established itself in various universities and in various disciplines, not only in literature, all across the humanities and the arts, and perhaps also occasionally in a medical school, I don't know, in North America. At the same time, translation studies was becoming a discipline. I don't know whether it has yet become a discipline in North America and Canada, yes, but struggling. In Europe, yes, in Spain, in England, but some of the programs are being closed in England right now. Spain is quite big in translation studies. The Netherlands is big in translation studies, Belgium, and so on. Israel, there's a strong push from Israel. So at the same time as feminism is establishing itself in Anglo-America, translation studies is coming along. And out of that combo came feminist translation. And it originated, I think, some people might argue, but I think really the argument has been made that it originated in and through Canada. Canada is bilingual. Canada has a French-speaking province, Quebec, which was very strongly influenced by French philosophy of the 1970s and 1980s. Jacques Derrida, Foucault, all kinds of people like that, Hélène Cixous, that they were reading in French 10 or 15 years before that work was translated into English for North American Anglophone readers. So very much ahead of that particular game, women writers in Quebec began to experiment with language that would suit them. There was one of these famous writers, Nicole Brossard, who's a very experimental writer, would claim, how can we use this language, French, which works against us, women writers? This language is so grammatically marked with the masculine. The feminine is always something weird and wonderful that is attached on. At one point she wrote, Je suis un E muet, I'm a silent E, because the silent E is always what marks the feminine in French, and so on. So there was a lot of work done on language, also content, obviously, but the form of the material, of the tools that we have to write with. And because we're in Canada, things got translated, and especially into English by one very voluble and very scholarly academic by the name of Barbara Goddard. She not only translated experimental texts from Quebec that played with language and tried to create a language for women to use when they write, she tried to translate this into English. And of course, it's a major operation to translate anything experimental into another language and make sense of it and make it useful and meaningful. And here I'm just going to go into what I wrote about her. Feminist translation, yeah. And the big names that came out of Quebec, or out of this combination of Canada and of Quebec and English Canada, Barbara Goddard, a woman by the name of Suzanne de Lotbinière Harwood, who wrote a book about her work as a translator, half in English, half in French, and all of the linguistic problems that she has as a feminist lesbian trying to deal with the aggressiveness, the hostility of the French language, of standard French. Sherry Simon is another name out of that time. A discourse that began to flourish around translation at this time, theorizing translation as production and not reproduction, and that's really important because it comes up again and again, as a deliberate rewriting that reflects cultural, literary, linguistic, ideological differences manifested in texts, also brought into being the feminist translator. So translation at the time in translation studies is seen as something very creative, productive, producing knowledge rather than reproducing what someone else said or someone else wrote. And the feminist translator affirms, in quotation, her critical difference, her delight in interminable rereading and rewriting. She flaunts the signs of her manipulation of the text. That's Barbara Goddard. The idea that a text could and perhaps should be woman-handled, also Barbara Goddard, meant replacing the conventional, modest, self-effacing translator with an active participant in the creation of meaning, Barbara Goddard. This change in long dominant ideas about the translator mechanically reproducing text, striving for equivalence and transparency, but never achieving it, always failing to reproduce the original, and operating as an invisible hand that turns words of one language into another, went well with other feminist critiques of conventional views on translation. So the translator is being set up as someone who is creative, someone who produces knowledge, not someone who runs after the existing text and tries to be faithful, always failing. So that idea fit really well with other ideas, but notably the traditional gendering of translation as a lesser, a weaker, a reproductive, feminine activity. There's a fantastic article. If you don't know it, take a look at it. It's written by Laurie Chamberlain, dated 1992, but it was written earlier and came out in Signs, I think. It's now in one of the big translation handbooks by Lawrence Venuti. And it has to do with, it's entitled something like Gender as a Metaphor for Translation, something like this. And she goes through English, mainly, literary history, and pulls out citations that show how translation has systematically, in that literature, been feminized and presented as weak, reproductive, the opposite of how we see it now in translation studies. Okay, so this feminist stance that Barbara Goddard promoted very strongly. She was a professor at York University in Toronto, and wrote and wrote and wrote, and appeared in conferences. And in the early 90s, I remember people shouting at her in the translation studies conferences to get her to sit down and stop talking about feminist translation. There's no such thing, and so on. In Coventry, at where Susan Bassnett is, all kinds of places. And she just kept at it. So the feminist stance countered this notion of the translator as a weak little reproductive failure with the proud and loud assertion that henceforth the feminist translator would flaunt her signature in italics, in footnotes, even in prefaces. Again, Barbara Goddard. So that's some of the where this comes from. Of course, feminist translation was going on in the US as well. There are a couple of people who wrote on it, not so many. Carol Meyer is one. A woman whose name escapes me right, Levine, Suzanne Levine, who was teaching in California, in San Diego, I believe. They translated from Spanish male poets, male writers, and found ways to undermine what they call the machismo of that they found in the text. And they wrote a couple of articles on that, and Suzanne Levine, a book, but in not as powerfully as Goddard wrote. And she also included literary criticism later on, and brought all kinds of other things in. So maybe just to backtrack a little bit, she talks about strategies, or she talks about the translator flaunting her signature. And since then, all kinds of strategies of feminist translation have been pinpointed, and people have tried to figure out, what do you do exactly as a feminist translator? Well, one of the things is you write a long preface. You explain what is going on in your translation with reference to the earlier text. You explain why you chose that text to translate it. You don't translate any old text. You choose carefully which text you propose to put your energy into. You flaunt, and you do all kinds of other things. You change the language. You change the heavy standard male grammatical forms, for instance, into plurals or into feminine forms. You undermine here and there loud posturing on the side of a character that you don't necessarily approve of. You get involved in the text. And which has been done in all translation around the world. It's nothing new. What's new is that you point to where you're doing this in the text. You put a footnote. You say, hooray, I changed this because it really annoyed me and it's not appropriate for my time and space, and you write about it in the preface. So you are not ashamed of the work you do. You do not hide the work you do. You flaunt it. That's the main difference. All those other techniques appear in every translation, I think. Changing the text. We know every translation changes a text. So sometimes more, sometimes less. So those are the main strategies. I had to write an article on this a while ago on the strategies, and I put as a last strategy, work for free. Because feminist translation, if you choose certain texts and translates, nobody will pay you for them, and you're really lucky if you get them published as well. So the feminist translator usurps and takes over this position of the translator as a humble little quiet being who can always be criticized for not getting it properly. So these ideas developed quickly into translation strategies, like I said, broader theorizing about subjective and political, ideological aspects of translation and translation history, and into loads of translation projects of women's writing, translated into English and into a number of European languages. There were entire publishing houses in Germany, for instance, that set up lists of women writers, translated into German, and in English it was similar. Research appeared on women's roles as translators and their impact, on the translation of women writers, on the treatment through translation of so-called key texts, the Bible, for one. There's been a lot of work on feminist criticism of Bible translations. Who else? Bible, Beauvoir, the whole scandal around the Beauvoir translations into English, and so on. And work also on the fate of fictional, gendered characters in translation. And there's a wonderful article by Leah Leone, who was a translation studies PhD and went to work off in Milwaukee, has now turned in other directions, where she looks at the work of translation done by Borges into Spanish of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, but also of other texts by Virginia Woolf. And whoop, the mixed, the kind of uncertain gendered characters suddenly acquire a real standard gender, and all kinds of language changes, and Borges sorts out Virginia Woolf. It's really interesting when you look at the details, and I always think that those of us in translation who work between languages, comparing texts, we have a completely different view of those texts than many other people do who just read the translations and that's all they get. We can compare and be kind of like detectives. So the success and impact of feminist approaches to both translation and translation studies were further solidified in the 90s when the topic was included in handbooks and encyclopedia. There are translation studies encyclopedia now, 2 or 3 editions, maybe 4, all kinds of handbooks. But dissenting and cautioning voices arose occasionally. Gayatri Spivak didn't hold back. The Politics of Translation, I don't know if you know that article from 1992. Yeah. Another woman, Rosemary Araujo from Brazil. Not very many, but largely they wrote in regard to post-colonial concerns around the appropriation of women writers' texts from around the world through translation for individualist, careerist purposes. So especially Spivak writes about that. And Spivak also writes about the translationese that is produced, the facile reading, quick reading English, just translate a whole bunch of material from India so that people in New York can read it and it sounds just like something that might have been written in New York. That's what she claims. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Maybe we can hear about it. But that's translationese in her terms. As such criticisms increased, it became clear that that particular era of feminism, and I put that in my title of my book, Translation in the Era of Feminism, needed to broaden its purview and reach out to other culture in less colonialist ways. It was very North American and European, going back and forth between those literatures mainly, and focus on wider swaths of translation activity in political and cultural contexts beyond the Anglo-American Eurozone. So that's the first part, more or less, of where feminist translation came from and what it does, and it does still. Then, disturbances and transnational onsets. Issues around post-colonialism were important for the more diversified shift away from the Anglo-American European focus in feminist translation studies, which is where it started. Other gender identity politics also came to disturb the success of that particular era of feminism, notably the rise in Anglo-American academia of pluralized and fluid genders, queer theory, LGBTQ, and trans interests, These identity politics affected feminist work in various ways, often causing it to be seen as old-fashioned, essentialist, stuck in outdated binaries, or just plain retrograde. There's been a certain amount of publication on that. And titles of publications in translation studies looking at women in translation, for instance, began to elide any reference to feminism as well as overt references to women. It's very cool that the titles of the books change, but it's still, the content is still very much on feminist translation. Nevertheless, theories travel, changing and adapting as they do, and feminist work in and on translation was soon flourishing in other parts of the world, in India, the Middle East, East Central Europe, Russia, and Brazil. The focus now largely on how translatable and how useful Anglo-American European feminist materials are for these new places where they are being translated into. And the challenges and difficulties, both practical and political, caused by the influx of foreign feminist work led to further anti-colonial criticism as well as activist work to promote indigenous local forms of feminism. Niranjana is someone who's written about that. She's an academic, an Indian academic who did her PhD at the University of California, I believe, and then went back to India to work in this area. In 1998 already, she raised questions in India about the post-colonial, quote, language of universalist humanism inherent in Anglo-American European feminisms and conveyed in English and via Anglo-American scholarship and influence, and then asked more questions about the conceptual frameworks articulated in this discourse. And she points to two translation problems facing feminist work in India. On the one hand, there are the multilingual aspects of the country. Official languages of Hindi and English are not available to every woman, and so translation is absolutely necessary when you want to create a feminist, I don't like the word community, but let's say feminist gatherings, feminist activities, feminist scholarship. And on the other, there's a gap between English-speaking educated Indian elites, quotation marks, who, she says, translate the most visible and political articulations of women's rights questions and reduce them to a distinction between urban and rural, modern and traditional, with the second term being the repository of backwardness. So she identifies two of the main challenges facing feminist translation work beyond the Anglo-American Eurozone. First, a perceived disregard, even disdain, for local knowledges and customs, as they are pushed aside by more powerful imported foreign thinking. And second, the perceived colonialization of the local as it learns, in quotation marks, from the international English-European materials. One response to this dilemma can be found in a collection entitled Provocations. I don't know how many of you know that book, 2015. Susan Bordeaux is one of the co-editors. A transnational reader in the history of feminist thought, it's called. And where materials from various cultures and eras that can be read as feminist, weren't necessarily read as feminist, but can be read as feminist or woman-centered, are presented and discussed in order to note the prevalence worldwide of centuries of thought that can be seen as feminist, even though in its own culture it may not be so recognized. It's a fantastic collection that brings together translated work that can be understood as feminist, writes an introduction to that work, the segment is there, the excerpt is there, and then questions and comments afterwards to demonstrate that there have been feminist ideas at many times in the past in many different cultures, and that it's not just top down from North America to the others. So now towards transnational feminist translation studies, which I think here is quite pertinent. Since the late 1990s, feminist scholars have worked toward the transnational, trying to incorporate, address, and understand other cultures and constituencies, often in response to and in criticism of international development, gender mainstreaming language and policies that tend to universalize gender, reserving the term largely for women, yet rendering local women and their lives secondary, if not invisible, in the process. There's been a lot of publication on that, mainly from people working in international development and such fields. So they're not translators, but they point to the damage done and the need for translation of ideas and concepts, the damage done when they're just imposed. Such scholars are not interested in the world of translation studies, but they refer to the need to translate global gender norms, as some international project puts millions of dollars into Rwanda and attaches a gender mainstreaming requirement. Nobody knows exactly what that is. How do you carry it out? What does it mean? And it's increasingly difficult to work with. They also talk about norm translators. So we need to translate global gender norms. What are global gender norms? And we need to have norm translators in these development projects. But the criticism doesn't go much further than that. They don't actually look at the words that need to be translated. A focus on actual translation, the interlingual, sometimes word for word rendering of another culture's text, representation and the dissemination of those texts has been developing in a post-Anglo-American European feminist world, and its transnational approach is generally assigned a certain democratizing power. And here I'm going to cite from an article that was just published 2021, which claims transnational feminist translation emphasizes the ethical role translation has in facilitating cross-border, cross-linguistic alliances between women which challenge prevailing hegemonies and regimes of oppression operating in neoliberal societies.
Can you do that again?
What?
Say it again.
How do we apply this? I don't know.
Can you say it again? Yeah.
Okay. Transnational feminist translation emphasizes the ethical role translation has in facilitating cross-border and cross-linguistic alliances between women, which challenge prevailing hegemonies and regimes of oppression operating in neoliberal societies. Olga Castro is one of the writers. She's Galician from Spain, works in England, and Laura Spoturno from Argentina, the two of them put this together. They have a second point. Further, such transnational initiatives are described as undermining the influence of international or global, brackets, Western, feminist applications and, quote, combining the struggle against patriarchal structures and systemic inequalities with a struggle against power dynamics among and within women. So, two sides. And finally, and I'll summarize this in a second. Finally, feminist transnational approaches foreground an intersectional perspective that considers how race, gender, sex, class, and other layers of oppression interact. I had a PhD student recently who was participated in an intersectional feminist translation of a famous American book called Our Bodies, Ourselves into French for Quebec. A really interesting project. They translated 4 or 5 chapters of that book, and in the process I learned the word épicène in French. Épicène, I believe, exists in English. It's not used a lot, but it means gender-neutral language, épicène. So as much as possible they had to use épicène language because they're making it as intersectional as possible, and very often the word woman disappeared. So it was the person with a uterus rather than a woman. Really interesting problems that she wrote. She did that project and then wrote her dissertation at the same time on those issues. Yeah, so transnational work thus seems to rest on 3 major ideas. First, resistance to the power of neoliberal economies. Second, rejection of the global applications of feminism devised in these economies. And third, the empowerment of women from all groups and categories worldwide, regardless of differences and oppressions. So that's where feminist translation in the transnational mode is heading, has headed, and there's a certain amount of publication in that area now that really calls itself transnational, but I don't know about actual translations of texts, but certainly articles, scholarly articles, academic articles on such topics. Yeah. I think that the hegemony of English as a lingua franca, and English as the language, grand language of academia, English as one of the main languages on the internet, is a bit of a challenge to such transnational hopefulness. And it's very difficult to see how that can be changed. So the transnational, in one book recently there was a call for a translated project from Tamil to Galician, which is one of the 4 other languages in Spain, to be noticed and to be made more of than just kind of falling aside. So Tamil women feminist initiatives translated into Galician. And I can say, yeah, it would be really good to hear more about that. But you have to write about it in English, basically, in order for it to spread, in order for it to get out and about. And so it's difficult now. So I have a little bit more here on what's been happening in terms of Arabic work in feminist translation, Arabic research, the fact that they've translated the word gender as al-gender, or all-gender, I think the al is right down here somewhere, at least in certain places. But again, largely around the American University in Cairo. That's where that material is being published. Also, there's been work on so-called, on kind of religious and political interests in the Middle East that are stopping, that are building, yeah, so kind of trying to prevent North American Western feminism from coming in, and I'll talk about that again with regard to Sri Lanka. So people are turning towards Islamic feminism to try and work that into something workable, adding material from North America, or from the West, if you like. In East Central Europe and Russia, the considerable funding that became available immediately upon the fall of the Berlin Wall, so in the early 90s, all through the 90s, and the collapse of Soviet power had the effect of introducing translations of feminist materials in not always very effective or readable ways. There have been lots of articles on that. Huge funds arrived from the Ford Foundation, from all the big foundations, from the Soros Foundation, to allow people to translate material that up to then had not been available in East European and Russian, East European languages and Russian. And people have written about that. Tatiana Bartunova is one who notes the uneasy transfer of feminist ideas and gender theory due to naive translators, she says, for whom English feminist terminology such as agency or empowerment had no meaning, and certainly no equivalent in Russian. That's in the early to mid-90s, late 90s. Now things have changed a little. Cornelia Slavova in Bulgaria points out that unlike feminist movements in North America and Western Europe, which came into being through years of grassroots women's organized activism, the feminist projects in the post-communist world emerge as a process of translating Western liberal ideas. In other words, through the importation of foreign matter. Also, the chaotic and chronologically disordered process of translating Western feminist materials into Slavic languages put a further strain on their reception. So Judith Butler gets translated before Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, those kinds of things, depending on who's available for the translation, who's funding what. Slavova posits and describes a reaction to the subsequent top-down strategy of infusing gender equality through legislation, funding, and university programs. That's not unlike the colonialist situation addressed by Niranjana in India 20 years earlier. Feminism, in other words, is seen by many as imposed from elsewhere, and gender even more so. So nor is there much work available as yet on the translation of Russian or East European, Bulgarian, Polish feminist materials from east to west, or north or south, or even east to east. It's still very closed. Similarly, South America, there's been a certain amount of work, like I said, Sporturno in Argentina. In Brazil, there's a certain amount of work being carried out at a number of universities and publications as well. But now, if you don't mind, what time is it? 9:43. Can I go another 10 minutes or so? Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about this one example from Sri Lanka, where what I think was a really interesting and useful methodological transnational approach to bring feminist work through translation into a place which otherwise seems to be rejecting it. So the researchers, Kanchuka Dharmasiri, she did her PhD at University of Massachusetts Amherst with yeah, and then returned to Sri Lanka as a assistant professor. So she was looking for ways to have her students who are working in Sinhala language. They're not English medium students. There's a kind of difference. English medium students are the most wealthy ones who go to private schools and are taught in English. Sinhala are the second rank in a way students who know little English. So she wanted to find ways to get them to read Western feminist authors in an increasingly ethnocentric environment that sneered at such foreign material. And she resorts to Therigatha, a compendium of 2,000-year-old texts written by Buddhist nuns, or orally recorded and then written down later by Buddhist nuns about their female condition. And she's able to demonstrate remarkable parallels between the thinking, or what the Buddhist nuns or certain characters in this Therigatha express, and that of 18th century Mary Wollstonecraft and 20th century Simone de Beauvoir. Wow. And what she proposes, and I think methodologically it's just so interesting. She starts from this problem, and I kind of summarized it and pulled it together yesterday out of this book here. Hang on a second. Here. She starts from the problem that feminism is not welcome in Sri Lanka, basically. And she writes here that a certain amount of feminist works have been translated, but they are not widely available and not read nearly as often as theories such as Marxism. There seems to be a commonly accepted consensus as to their nature. Kumari Jayawardena points out the words feminism and feminist have become emotive words that often evoke hostile reactions in Sri Lanka and negative responses from a variety of people, including traditionalists, political conservatives, and even certain leftists. So, in her project, to think about and to wonder how she can get some material, at least, to her Sinhala University students, she decides that she is going to go to Therigatha and extract from Therigatha material that can frame the French translated material, or Mary Wollstonecraft, Beauvoir translated, Mary Wollstonecraft translated into Sinhala. So, how does one pursue this translation project? And I think I just described it. Yeah. And why the Therigatha? So let me see the Therigatha. Here it is. She writes, since the negative responses to anything slightly associated with feminism come from spaces of unchallenged patriarchal privilege, nationalist fervor, and the assumption that women in Buddhist contexts do not need such ideas because Buddhism is an egalitarian religion, it is especially apt to bring into this discussion a text such as Therigatha. Compiled in the 4th century BCE, the verses in Therigatha provide the earliest extant evidence of women's experience in any of the world's religious traditions, according to Collins, 1997. It contains verses by Theris, Buddhist nuns who have attained nirvana, the ultimate liberation in Buddhist practice, and commentaries on their background. While some of the biographical commentaries offer detailed accounts of the Theris' lives, others briefly explain why these women made the decision to follow the spiritual path. Therigatha covers a wide selection of women's lives from diverse social strata, We hear from mothers, wives, princesses, prostitutes, and courtesans, all enlightened when they utter these verses of liberation. So there's her justification for using Terigata as a method to introduce and frame 19th and 20th century feminist thought in Sinhala. So, and she succeeds. She also says that the Terigata, or certain stories from the Terigata, are well known in Sri Lanka, have been turned into movies, have been turned into stories and narratives. People recognize those stories, recognize certain characters and certain women characters, and there's apparently some very tragic ones about mothers whose children are lost in fire, and then they arrive somewhere and the house has burnt down because of a lightning strike, and the woman is all by herself. Those kinds of tragedies are available in popular culture, but drawn from Terigata, or certain parts of it. She goes to Terigata, and she finds that there are certain parallels that she thinks are useful. First of all, reference to the domestic sphere. And she focuses on a particular character referred to, or she named Subha. I don't know how to pronounce it. Subha, I think, right? A glottal stop. An upper class woman who becomes a nun because she's dissatisfied, not content with lay life. She seeks the spiritual path. Along with her, there are two others that she refers to who are just tired of being wives, tired of doing domestic work, tired of being set off and spending their lives in the kitchen, literally. So Subha, here she writes, Subha is one of these people that she can line up with Wollstonecraft. And the question is, she doesn't do so really, really aggressively. She just writes, it is true that Wollstonecraft and Subha belong to two distinct eras and contexts. But is there a possibility of looking at the connections and disconnects between these writings? In what ways can we rethink women's position in society and the domestic space in two very different contexts, using Subha's notion of the painted doll, which is how she saw herself in this upper class life, and Wollstonecraft's contestation of the notion of the angel of the house. Wollstonecraft believed that women were weakened in the process of becoming the subdued objects of men's admiration. Subha strongly feels that she would be relegated to a limited space if she agrees to the rogue's proposal. The rogue is someone who propositions her and offers her golden life if she abandons her decision to become a Buddhist nun. So, drawing those kinds of parallels between Wollstonecraft and Subha, she goes on to a second point, the body. First point, domestic space. Second point, the body. And here, I don't really understand. I don't know, I'm sure many here know more than I do, but she writes that Teris, women, have a different view of the body than the monks. For them, the female body is an object of evil for the monks. The female body is an object of evil that deters them from the path. It is other. It is marked. The female body is marked in a certain way. And so for the nuns, it is twice marked. They themselves have this body that is evil and that is marked, and so they must overcome this body or deal with it somehow. And she asks again, Kanchuka, what societal elements make the woman the marked sex and the male the unmarked one? Why does the woman's body have to be marked even after death? Why does it remain an object of desire even in the corpse state? Students who might ask such questions concerning the Terigata might also be interested in reading Simone de Beauvoir. Her work, Simone de Beauvoir's work, to see how she addresses such issues. In her introduction to the first volume of The Second Sex, Beauvoir examines how women are relegated to the status of the other from a very young age. She illustrates with several examples how young girls and boys are conditioned to view the female as being lesser than the male. In patriarchal discourse, the man not only becomes the unmarked subject, the sovereign self, he's also seen as positive. So on. I mean, it's much more elaborate than I can make it here. But the third point, hang on, where's my page? So we have we had the domestic space, the body, and now gender. In Therigatha, there's a character by the name of Soma, who has recently attained enlightenment, and she is confronted and challenged by Mara. Mara, the embodiment of evil and temptation. I'm citing. Who often takes the form of a woman, of course. He questions her intellect he questions Soma's intellect and confronts her because she's a woman. So you have to question her intellect because she's a woman. But Soma is unmoved, and she even problematizes the idea of binary gender. Poof, I don't care about gender. So, and this again, it's developed. And Kanchuka writes, Soma defeats Mara because she's able to transcend the binary gender system. She questions the binary of man-woman itself, asserting that the possibility of any subject attaining the highest level of enlightenment questions the idea of gender itself. In an interesting way, Soma's answer reverberates with modern notions of gender, though it is placed in a context of spiritual practice. Now, question, would it be possible for us to utilize Soma's claims pertaining to the space of nirvana and its undifferentiated existence of gender to proceed to analyze the concept of gender as it appears in modern feminism? Would Soma's verse serve as an apt starting point to engage with Judith Butler's theories of gender? Soma's verse, maybe I should back up a little bit, is, anyone who thinks I'm a woman or a man or am I anything at all, that's who Mara's fit to address. Mara, the bad guy, or the bad. Okay, so in her conclusion, Kanchuka writes, the translation project to bring contemporary feminist writing into Sinhala purview is to do so, through she tries to do so, chooses to do so through a well-established Buddhist women's text, Therigatha, and thereby introduce materials as potentially parallel. Or at least show students, the students who've been rejecting it in the environment that is current apparently, to get them to think and to get them to ask questions about both aspects, the Therigatha on one hand, and then see the echo, say, in the contemporary feminist writing. And the purpose, again, to counter the facile dismissal of feminism as an alien entity, explore discourses of women's liberation situated in South Asia, and explore liberatory aspects in Therigatha further. So far, she's had maybe 5 characters in Therigatha that she's pulled out and used. Are there others? Could students be assigned a research assignment to find others that can be, where parallels can be drawn? So that's a kind of a look at the work of Kanchuka. Briefly, to finish up, what time is it? Yeah, 10 o'clock, that's enough. What I have to say, maybe one central question in all of this translation around feminist topics for many cultures and languages swirls around the word gender. Gender mainstreaming, gender bender, gender, all kinds of gender. What does it mean? How can it be translated? Should it actually be translated or simply transliterated and thus leaving it foreign? Joan Scott, whom most of you know as a historian, has addressed this question in 2016, pointing to the many different uses and meanings of the term in English. People use gender in so many different ways and for so many different purposes. She writes, there's no single original concept of gender to which subsequent translations might refer. Instead, there's been an ongoing conversation across linguistic and cultural boundaries in which the term is addressed, disputed, qualified, and adapted. In the process, the ambiguities that the term itself has acquired, the tensions it contains, are revealed. So there's the uncertainty and diversity of usage alone make it untranslatable. So that's Joan Scott coming from English, but having written a long text that has to do with the issues around trying to translate the word gender into French, the word gender into German, the different terms that are available, I think, in Bulgarian or in Russian. She brings it all together and says nobody has none of these languages can come up with a term because the term in English itself is so loose. Yeah, and while enterprising feminist translators and editors such as Hala Kamal at University of Cairo are not averse to coining a new term, out of gender, and defending it, the overall tendency seems to be to leave it untranslated and therefore forever foreign. A late 20th century Anglo-American coinage that may not have much to do with worldwide feminist theorizing or translating. It remains untranslatable. In German it's gender, in French it's often gender or genre. We talked about it last night. Yeah, it's a problem. It remains a problem. Voila, that's what I have to say.
We have time for questions.
Yeah, that's your question.
Thank you so much for this talk. It feels so overdue in our Tibetan translation milieu. I remember Karma Lekche Somo in one of the Sadra translation and transmission conferences raising the issue of gender and translation, and it was this kind of kerfuffle that happened, and the men on the stage kind of froze. It was very memorable, and I just love this idea of flaunting, right? Flaunting one's signature and actually intervening, but also pointing to it, not masking it. And I think this is one of the questions in this conference is what to do with misogynist passages in Buddhist texts. You know, do we show the misogyny, right? And that's important, right? To show that exists in the tradition, or do we clean it up for present day readers and users of those texts, the Buddhists who might be reading and using our translations? And I think the other thing, so I'm just raising kind of questions for our group, is I think there's an ambiguity sometimes in the Tibetan that is made certain in the English. And Somsobum and I encountered this in our translations together. And I wonder now at the masculinity of English that requires you to kind of nail it down, keep it short, make it direct, you know, and could we find ways in our translations to mirror the sentence structure, or you know, the way the subject is sometimes not named. And certainly, of course, we have to do away with the impulse of previous generation of translators who often resolved an ambiguity with the pronoun he, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways that we could work with this, and I think you've raised some wonderful, wonderful questions for our conference and workshop. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
I have a question about where we are now. I think sometimes in terms of shapes. So if the 80s was the era of feminism, where translation studies was burgeoning, and where being a feminist translator moved, I loved your expression, from being a weak little reproductive failure to flaunting her signature. And so that was an era of flourishing. And now we are in the transnational feminist translation era that bears some hope in your estimation, but yet there's a sort of dark cloud in the silver lining given the hegemony of English. And I'm wondering, is this a pendulum back to the shape question. Is this a pendulum? Is this a cycle? Is it a circle? Are we going from a flourishing in the 80s to a kind of, is this a moment of expansion in translation studies and in feminist translation studies? You described this like study of titles, right, which is so interesting, the way that the word feminism, and I think maybe more broadly an emphasis on, so the way this fades out, are we fading back in? So that's what I mean, are we swinging back towards that? Where are we heading? And then just like a sub question within that, is there now, like there's this flip side, right? The weak little reproductive failure and then all of a sudden flaunting her signature, that's two sides of a coin. What is the feminist translator now? Do these words, feminism and translation, belong together? Or are we in danger of falling on some essentialized notion of gender? Or are we so afraid of that we're afraid to say anything? Or are we willing to articulate something? I don't know. That's what I want to know. Where are we going?
I have noticed, because I'm kind of, in a way, the grand old lady of feminist translation. So I've noticed in the past 10 years, many young scholars getting hold of me, but people not from Canada and the US, people from South America, from India, from Turkey, from all kinds of places that with whom there has been little contact in feminist translation, younger scholars wanting to work in this field, in China as well. And I see it as broadening and very much operating in languages other than the European, like what I call the Anglo-American Eurozone. The Anglo-American Eurozone has been overdosed a little bit with feminism and with translation, with feminist translation, I feel, although there's a special conference in Greece next week where I will be. I don't know. It keeps going. It doesn't die. It keeps going. But more importantly is that there's a whole crew of younger 30, 35-year-old scholars in Brazil, in Argentina, in Greece, in various places, in China as well, working on these questions, or related questions, and wanting to know more about it. And special journals coming. There's a special journal being founded by Spoturno in Argentina, together with Castro in England, with Routledge, called Feminist Translation Studies, coming shortly. So, feminism really got I think, and others have written on this, got hammered by gender is plural, right? And so the binary that feminism depends on, or has depended on, and has learned to address differently, really affected it. From the early 2000s on, for at least 10 years, there was little publication. But then it started up again, 2013, 2015, 2017. There's a double issue of Mutatis Mutandis, which is a translation studies journal that comes out of Columbia. Double issue that has just come out, that came out last year, a special issue, Transnational Feminist Translation, etc. So, it's there. And broadening, but moving away from Anglo-America and Europe, or going beyond, reaching beyond Anglo-America and Europe. One of this book that I put together, it's a big chunker like this, Routledge Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender. There's an article in there by an Arabic writer from Egypt on the translation of labels on cleaning materials that are circulated in the Arab world, which all, for some strange reason, have the feminine ending on how to use, who should use, and so on. She points. We've never in Anglo-America or Europe have we written an article on such a topic. And those kinds of things are coming, and I think it's really, it's changing, and but the impetus is there, and
I think I'm going to use the microphone power to ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much again, just to echo the thanks. It was really masterful and just a delight.
Hey, was it masterful or mistressful?
Oh,
Mistress is a problem.
Extraordinary. It was really extraordinary. Thank you so much. Suddenly sweating. So I have a question about the. I was so moved by the flaunting and the not being ashamed or hidden and being willing to sort of articulate. Like, this made me upset, so I changed it. I'm wondering about the intersection of feminism, the uneasy relationship historically that feminism has had with religion, because we're translating Buddhist texts and Buddha Vachana. And so I think that there can often also be an uneasiness around when the stakes are like your liberation from an eternal cycle of suffering, and this is about like liberating your mind. And the instructions within lineage, so lineage is so crucial within Buddhism, and when you have texts that, I think one of the things that makes the patriarchy and androcentrism of Buddhism so damaging is that it's wedded to liberation, and the stakes are really, really high. And so I'm wondering, like, how does then, like, the feminist translator, and I think of the feminist translator also, like, I would identify as a feminist translator, how do we grapple with that? How do we flaunt when we're also translating the words of the Guru and the Buddha, and that are about liberating your mind?
Yeah. I was asked that because I've written a couple of articles on Bible translation.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, I can't really speak to the Buddhist tradition at all. But on Bible translation, there have been several really strong retranslations and prefaced and explained retranslations of Genesis, for instance, and the story of the creation of the atom from the ground, called the Adama, not Adam with a capital A. It's just a little creature made of dirt. Anyway, and people ask, why bother? Why bother correcting that stuff? It's so old. Do we really care anymore? Who are you revising the Bible for? That's one attitude, right? Let it go. And then the other attitude is to say, well, those biblical texts have affected 2,000 years of human life, especially especially women's lives. We need to know what they say. We need to be able to correct or to change or to address them somehow. So it's worth knowing. It's worth knowing. What does the text actually say? But nobody can know what the text actually says. That's the problem. These texts are so ancient. They've been written, they've been rewritten, and they've been revised and edited and published here and changed there. It's very difficult. But I think there are those two main attitudes. Why bother with that old stuff? And then we're moving on to other things. And then the other attitude is we need to understand our tradition and where that tradition comes from and where the pain and suffering has come from, and that it shouldn't have to point the finger at who made us suffer and be pained. It's difficult, and it's so interesting to read a clever and an intelligent and an academic retranslation. I can advertise one. There's a woman by the name of Korsak, Korsak, who's done fantastic Bible translations of Genesis. She calls it at the start rather than in the beginning, at the start. And she's also done a retranslation of the book of Mark. Why? She chose it. She said the book of Mark is a really strong book. Yeah, and did a retranslation. But always with copious translator notes that are interesting and understandable and not cloaked in academic verbiage. Really excellent. There's someone way at the back there.
Just two comments, and also to thank you again for a fantastic history. It's really very, very useful, so very appreciated by all of us. Just to, first of all, to follow up on Sarah's question of where are we at now transnationally, I think sometimes a lot of these theoretical discussions start to dissolve when we still have, the sort of major and really real, on the ground cases of misogyny, etc., like in the case what's going on in Iran right now, and these enormous, so like forget all the translation issues, women are being, tortured and killed in prison and, for their, and so on. So that's kind of keeping us alive, if nothing else. But I just wanted to add something, and you're probably very well aware of it, but the way in which the whole critique of the imposition of the Western values, in the rest of the world can be turned on its head. Just to give you a case out of Buddhism where, women today are arguing for full ordination in the monastic order. And then you have the patriarchal, power structure of the monastic order in Asia saying that, to these women, that your request is a Western, this is Western feminism that has, come into your, head, and you need to realize this is, a very Western thing. And so therefore actually using that argument against, what we understand as progress. So it's a real ethical dilemma when you feel like you're arguing for justice, and yes, you are speaking in English, on the platform and using the logic of the, European Enlightenment, but there are some reasons for that as well. So it's a very, very complicated problem, but just to make that comment.
Yeah. Tanchuka writes about that, the fact that, or I think I quoted it as well, that Buddhism, in some people's minds, Buddhism is a egalitarian religion, so women don't need feminism.
That's right. But then you look at the Therigatha, who it's very clear that for them it wasn't egalitarian. So.
Yeah. There's a question way at the back.
Yeah. That's the aspiration.
No.
Hi, hello, testing. Thank you for your, just so much, it's so rich, inspiring lecture. Could you review for us how to talk about feminism and feminist concerns in a way that is inclusionary to issues regarding transgender? Like, I noticed the university students are maybe more informed and able to talk about these issues, whereas the Buddhist groups I teach, they're really stumbling over when to use female, when to use woman. Does feminism need a new term now? Do we call it something else? Is this, past womanism to something else? Or, so could you just review for us what is the language that we could use that would be less exclusionary, but also still putting forward the feminist concern with women, with violence towards women, just helping us to practice in a language in a conscious way, given, as what you mentioned, how the paradigm of genders has really changed how feminism can be expressed in good ways.
I don't know that I can review anything on that topic because I haven't worked on that topic at all. I know that in Canada, at least, transgender language is available and is used at university in certain places, in certain courses. I recently read a book in translation studies by a guy who teaches in Hong Kong, an American who teaches in Hong Kong, where the entire book was full of gender, or he used gender neutral pronouns, not he or she, but z and zer and things like this. Douglas Robinson is his name. But apart from that, I don't know that much has been done in the field of translation with regard to transgender. There is a certain amount, surely, if you looked for it, you would find it, but I haven't worked on it. And so I would be incapable of reviewing it or providing a review. There's a handbook coming out, one of these big fat handbooks that Routledge is producing right now, a handbook on sexuality, translation and sexuality. and a handbook on translation and homosexuality and something else. One of the editors is Brian Baer. He's at Kent State University. You'd be better off contacting someone there. There's also Klaus Kindl at University of Vienna, who's one of the co-editors. There's a certain amount of material, but not something that I've looked at because I've always been focused on women. Someone at the very back too.
I want to add my boundless thanks as well. A lot to think about. The idea of an invisible hand that's always failing resonated for me, and I can imagine probably for one or two other translators here. And as intriguing and attractive as the idea of flaunting the signature, I think that in translating from Tibetan and in a Buddhist context, along with the sense of the importance of getting it right because there's so much at stake for people who are using the text, there's also the figure of the translator, which is highly prestigious, but whose posture is very much, I would say humility is very much a value, self-effacement is very much a value, and a lot of the sort of updating of Buddhist ideas that have been done through commentaries, the commentaries also take a posture of we're just holding up a lamp to the path, we're not innovating here. And so I think that's, for me, that's also a thing that would present a challenge to being willing to just flaunt the signature, because there is so much of a valuing of no, you're just, the silent, self-effacing person. So I'd actually love to hear from anyone, as well as from you, how to navigate that or what that would mean in this challenge that you're sort of throwing down to us.
That terminology of flaunting and woman handling in the text and so on, it dates from 1991, 1992, 1993, in there. And in a period where there was lots of room for that kind of attitude and lots of support. And Barbara Goddard obviously was not translating in a setting that you described, a kind of religious setting with a very kind of solid background and tradition. What was happening in Quebec and what those Quebec women writers were doing was absolutely rebelling against a system that they felt had kept them down, including a very, very strong Catholic Church. And so it was really a moment of big rebelliousness. How that transfers into your particular area and period, yeah, that's hard to say. Hard for me to say because I don't know the background that you're working in. But it takes one or two strong, courageous people to make changes like that.
Honorable Damsha, because we invited responses from the audience just quickly. I think it's possible to leave your signature everywhere as a translator, excuse me, from a position of humility. Humility not just for yourself as a translator, but for the practice of translation, and recognizing that it is always imperfect in some way. That's the nature of language, right? There is no perfect translation ever, and it's from that position of humility for the practice that I think we can't leave our signature.
Maybe I can add just briefly. I talked about it to someone yesterday that I participated in the PhD exam of someone who wrote about Rumi translation. So a mystic, Sufi, who wrote poetry in 800 years ago or so. And there was a lot of discussion about whether we, that PhD student, can assess what Rumi exactly was expressing 800 years ago in today's language, and whether that PhD student can assess what the translator into English did there, and that translator, all different, and that French translator, and that French translator, and that French translator. They're all versions. And sometimes there's a certain Rumi version or a version of English Rumi that circulates in the US and is very successful. But is it Rumi from 800 years ago? No, it's Rumi for certain Anglophone United States or US American readers now. And there's a difference. I'm sure that Rumi of 800 years ago would hardly recognize how his work is being presented here now. There's a different purpose, a different audience, a different use. And I think, I don't know how strictly religious Sufism is. It may not be quite as strict or kind of orthodox as what I gather you're describing. I don't know. But it's similar. It's similar. That question of who you're translating for, how that must change the text, who you are as a translator, what your attitudes are, who's sitting on your shoulder watching what you're doing.
Hi, I just wanted to add a little history about the Terigati because it fits with the time period, the chronology of all this. And one of the early translations was by Anne Waldman, who's a sort of beat generation poet, wild, flaunting woman, just totally, and it was beautiful. She's not a translator, so I think people recognized it as maybe not a translation. And then more recently, and I tried to get Anna, our editor at Shambhala Publications, sitting out there to talk about this, but another translation came called The First Free Women, and Shambhala Publications was sued for, Buddhists are always bickering also in different sects, and it was regarded as not an accurate translation, and this is quite recent, just a few years ago, and they had to pull it and change it and then not call it a translation in order to be able to put it out again. So I don't know, I'm thinking the Beat generation, there was this wild woman energy that was okay for everybody, and now everybody's gotten uptight.
But it also depends, how do you define a translation?
Yeah.
Who defines what a translation is? You can sell a book as a translation or what? An adaptation? A version? Who's to define? Who's going to claim they know exactly what a translation is and how it should look?
Hello. Thank you so much for your great presentation. But for me, most of the topic is very new to me. Especially about the feminist. I do hear the word feminist before, but I really don't know exact what it means. Is it working for only women right, or it is working for women is better than men, or equal to men, equal to men, like equal to men. And then I don't know. I took misunderstand or not because of my limitation of English. But what I understand is you guys talk a little bit about Theravada, Theravada, and then from the Theravada view, it's kind of like beating the woman. So I don't know it represents the Buddhist religion or not. From the Theravada view, is it represent for the Buddhist view? What I know. I started Buddhism almost like 20 years. But I was so proud as I am Buddhist because what I understand, what I learned in the Buddhist religion, respect women a lot. From the beginning of practice, we have to think and practice women as your mother. Put before yourself. How important to respect to the mother And all sentient beings, not only women, you have to think as a mother instead of beating. And then from the Tantric view, it's saying women are embodiment of the wisdom. So sometimes teachers are talking, you guys better than men because you are more wiser, because it's embodiment of Buddhism. So I'm a little bit confused. As Theravada, which kind of Buddhism, which kind of message can represent a Buddhism? So I'm not sure. If I take misunderstand, then I'm sorry. Because because of Theravada view, and then it's the Buddhism is building women, then I really confused. Till now, yesterday I told you guys I'm so proud, I'm so lucky because of Buddhist woman and Buddhist nun. Why I'm talking this one? Because I know those knowledge. How they're respecting to the women. So that's why I shared this one. So today, a little bit different. So that's why if I took mistake from the Theravada view and presentation, so I'm so sorry. But that I heard.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. I wonder if you could please expand a bit on the English translation of the scandal surrounding Beauvoir's translation. Everyone loves a scandal.
Yes, Simone de Beauvoir wrote her book in Le Deuxième Sexe in 1949. I believe it came out in translation in English very quickly. In 51 or 52, translated exclusively by a gentleman who was a professor at Smith College. Parsley is his name, Howard Parsley. And the publisher was Knopf. And Beauvoir's book had been bought. The rights had been bought by Blanche Knopf. Blanche was the wife of Mr. Knopf. And it was to be sold as a book about women's sexuality in the US.
You're kidding.
No. And it's one of my students wrote her MA thesis on that, which included her going down to Smith College and going through the archives on all of the letters that went back and forth between Knopf and Mr. Parsley, Howard Parsley, zoologist. And so she wrote a long thing on this because Mr. Parsley has been put down, or his memory has been put down, mistreated, harassed for the poor translation that he produced, for the pages that he left out, for the bits about important women characters in history that Beauvoir had in the book. He left all that out, and he's been blamed for it. But in fact, it was a publisher who required that this be cut, that be cut, the book be shortened to be able to, so that it might be sold as one volume rather than two big, thick tomes, etc. So that's, and of course, as a zoology professor whose French was, so he didn't necessarily get the existentialist terminology that Beauvoir and Sartre were in the process of inventing. They hadn't quite finished the invention of that yet, and she was using terminology and abstractions that he didn't get. And of course, that translation was the only one until 2009. 2009, a new translation comes out in English. And very murky circumstances. How did those two women get to translate Beauvoir and retranslate? And there are two American women living in Paris who have up till now been teaching English as a second language in colleges in Paris, and they've written a cookbook and horrible stories. Horrible. It turns out that one of the women had been teaching someone who ended up in a publishing house who said, "Oh yeah, we could do another Beauvoir, another retranslation of Beauvoir. She deserves it." anyways, these two ladies, one is called Chevalier, and the other one, can't remember, translated Beauvoir. But because they were so careful and so aware of all the discussion around the first translation of Beauvoir, they're very literal, terrified of making a mistake, following the text word for word in places, using very wooden language. It makes it difficult to read. It is not pleasant to read. It's all there. Nothing has been cut. The 15% of the book that was cut from the first version has been restored, but it's difficult to read. And then, of course, all hell broke loose when this book came out, and Toril Moy, who's a relatively well-known narratologist and literary critic, wrote a terrible scathing report on it in the London Review of Books, and it went on and on and on like that. And that is now the book that you could buy. Published 2009, it's called Le Deuxième Sexe still. Yeah. But all that to say that translation is something that moves and that is mobile and that people will like one day and dislike the next, and one person will love your translation, the other person will find 52 mistakes in it that only they can find, nobody else would find. It's so hard to pin down.
Janet.
I just want to make a comment. I know that we're out of time.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that we just had a moment just before when Ani Treyang actually made an extremely important statement, and it's absolutely everything that we're talking about now, and we really need to address the questions that she raised. You know, she's asking, she doesn't see, if I'm saying right, she doesn't see the problem that we're talking about in Buddhism. And what are we supposed to do now? Are we supposed to convince her that there is a problem that she doesn't see?
Yeah, well, maybe English.
Just let me finish for a second. I just want to pause and allow her voice to really be heard as a really, really interesting and important. And I'm so proud of that, just the fact that you spoke up so strongly from your perspective. This is really, really fascinating. And this is what our challenge is really is now.
Yes.
So thank you, Ani Treyang. But if you can have a comment, that would be good.
Holly, did you want to say something?
I want to say something else. But yes.
Yeah, we're about to.
Okay. Last word from me.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on this term that Lekshay just mentioned, scandal. And I do think that scandals elicit intrigue, but since you brought up that term, I just wanted to acknowledge one of the scandals that has been rippling through Buddhist communities globally around sexual abuse. And I just want to acknowledge here in this gathering where we've all gathered together to talk about women and gender in Buddhism, to acknowledge the pain and trauma of survivors. And I think that's just important that we hold that also in our discussions and in our heart.
Maybe another round of applause for a fantastic keynote.